We have known for decades that at some point during the around the year 2033 or 2035, if this date has moved a little bit, at some point the Social Security Trust Fund, which are the reserves of the Social Security system, is going to run out of money. When this happens, Social Security will not be able to pay the benefit in full. Based on the current estimate, it will be able to pay 75% of the benefit. So at this point, there will need to be a reform. Either you will have to raise the level of payroll taxes that fund Social Security, or you will have to lower the benefits or to move the retirement age.
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today.
When you think about retirement, there's no doubt that part of the discussion ends up being around Social Security and what it means for Americans. But when you factor it in, when you're looking at wealth inequality, is there a difference in what it is now compared to, say, a few decades ago? That's part of the research done by our guest here today, Sylvain, who is an assistant professor of finance here at the Wharton School. Sylvain, great to talk to you again. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Let's start, I guess, with the backstory on looking at these aspects of wealth inequality tied to Social Security.
Right. So as you mentioned, when people think of retirement, a big part of it is Social Security. Actually, for most Americans, most of their income during the retirement period does not come from the stock of wealth that they have at the beginning, but comes from the Social Security benefits that they receive. Now, all those promises that the government make, they have a value. So you could think of it like if you were to go on the private market, you could buy an annuity, and that annuity would basically offer exactly the same type of terms as Social Security. It would like provide a monthly payment until the end of your life. So there is a market value for what the government provides. And so one question is, once you try to value those benefits, the ones that you have already accrued because you have contributed into the system, what's the value of this? How does it change the level of inequalities that we see today? And does it change also the trends in wealth inequality? Because when we look at wealth excluding Social Security, we see a steady increase in wealth inequality since more or less the mid-1980s. But what we find in our paper is that once you factor in Social Security, this positive trend in wealth inequality basically disappear.
So when you think about value for Social Security, how has that changed over the last several decades?
So it has changed enormously, and this has implications both for households but also for the government, because of course what we consider as an asset for households is going to be a liability for the government. But we are talking about, I think right now, something that is close to $50 trillion, where like the total stock of wealth, excluding Social Security in the US, would be slightly more than 100 trillion. Right. So you have like 1/3 of the total that is Social Security, and which was not considered in inequality statistics before.
And so when you talk about the different income brackets, there's probably much more of a reliance on Social Security as a component of support in your retirement years for lower income families than it is for higher income families.
Exactly. So in general, as you move up in the income distribution, people receive higher benefits.
Yeah.
But that slope, that relationship is much less pronounced than if you look at wealth in general. And because there is much less inequality in Social Security benefits, adding it to the bucket of the things that you consider as wealth totally changes the picture that you have when you trace the level of inequality over time.
So then, with everything we've seen, especially in recent years, how then do we value Social Security benefits right now? And I guess maybe even more importantly, how potentially might we value them in the future? Because obviously there are so many questions about what Social Security might be in the next decade or so.
Right. So that's an important consideration. So we have known for decades that at some point during the around the year 2033 or 2035, if this date has moved a little bit, at some point the Social Security Trust Fund, which are the reserves of the social security system is going to run out of money. When this happens, social security will not be able to pay the benefit in full. Based on the current estimate, it will be able to pay 75% of the benefit. So at this point, there will need to be a reform. Either you will have to raise the level of payroll taxes that fund social security, or you will have to lower the benefits, or to move the retirement age. Now, in our paper, we take this into account. We have some tests, like what if we pay the benefit in full, what if we cut them by 20%, and we look at how it changes the trends in wealth inequality. But you have to remember that this is not news. This we have known. If you look at the Social Security reports that the Social Security Administration publishes every year about the health of the system, we have known that for decades. And so that was, in a sense, already known 40 years ago. And so it doesn't change the trends that much.
But the concept of inequality, though, has probably shifted over the last few decades as well.
So what do you mean by this?
Well, I mean, when you think about the impact of the inequality because of how Social Security has changed, we're seeing probably a much greater impact on inequality than we have in the past.
Right. And so there are several reasons for that. So one is that you have many more workers that are well covered by Social Security, or young retirees, than 40 years ago. Second, life expectancy has increased, though it has stagnated a little bit in more recent years, but over long period it has increased. And the third thing, which is, I think, the more interesting thing from a finance point of view, is that the level of interest rate has declined enormously. And so when you try to buy an annuity from an insurance, for example, the level of the interest rate is going to affect the value of this annuity. The lower the interest rates, the higher the value of the assets, such as Social Security, future Social Security benefits.
Well, and even that level of interest rate, as you kind of alluded to, has shifted, over the last 30 years or so. We went for such a long period of time with interest rates basically at zero. Then we saw that rise in and around the pandemic, and we still are seeing a higher rate of inflation than we saw, say, 20 years ago.
So what really matters here is the level of real interest rates. That is the difference between the level of nominal interest rates that you would see on a mortgage contract and the level of inflation. Because Social Security benefits are indexed on inflation. So when inflation goes up, it doesn't really hurt retirees as much as it hurts the rest of the population because they are protected against it. Now, the spread between the nominal interest rate and inflation is still very low relative to what it was in the 80s.
We've obviously had a lot of policy discussion around Social Security, especially lately. One of the things, obviously, that the current administration brought forward was not taxing Social Security benefits. All of these kind of ideas kind of filter into the mix as to that component of inequality in Social Security benefits.
Yeah, this kind of policy have big redistribution effects, especially not so much between rich and poor people, but more so between different generations. So, for example, if cutting what they call the Social Security tax is effectively increasing the Social Security benefit. Now, there is no free lunch. Social Security benefit in a pay-as-you-go retirement system are paid by workers. And so if you decide that the current cohorts of retirees will receive more benefits, that means that the deal is mechanically getting worse for younger generations. And so that's where that's the dimension on which the redistribution along this kind of policy operates. It's between generations.
And it's not a component of wealth that's transferable to that next generation as well.
Well, I mean, that's a choice for your parents or your grandparents. If they decide that these additional benefits or the not having to pay the tax on Social Security taxes, because just to be clear, the Social Security tax is not going to the federal government. It feeds back into the Social Security Trust Fund.
Right.
And so it's really I think the right way to think about it is an increase in benefits.
Right.
And so if your parents that are currently retired decide to save that money instead of spending it, then you as an individual, you will get it back through inheritance.
Right.
Now, not all Americans are equally situated on that dimension because, first of all, that Social Security tax is only going to go towards high-income Social Security recipients.
Right.
And so effectively what would happen is that you would have current workers whose parents have low Social Security benefits For them, it means that they will have to fund that increase in generosity for current retirees, but their parents will not be able to save that money to return
Sure.
it to them in the form of inheritance.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a transfer from like young generations to old generation, and potentially that transfer is kind of like offset by the inheritance mechanism, but not equally for all young Americans.
Right. I found it interesting in reading through the paper, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, is the impact or lack thereof of this component of Social Security benefits to inequality on the top 10%. Take us through why that's so important to this paper.
So because essentially when you look at the bottom 90%, so the rest of the population, for them Social Security is more or less half their wealth. Whereas for the top 10%, it's much smaller. And for the top 1%, it's like totally insignificant.
Right.
And therefore, when you ignore Social Security, you kind of like totally overlook the biggest chunk of wealth that the bottom 90% has, and you fully count the wealth of the top 10%, which is why including it really changes the picture.
I found it interesting. You also mentioned at the end of the paper, we're still kind of at a point where there's probably a lot more research to do in terms of looking into this and these impacts as we move forward, correct?
Right, because like our paper is mostly, in a sense, an accounting paper. We are just trying to measure how much wealth people have.
Right.
So it's not a measure of like the causal effect of Social Security on the distribution of wealth. Because if Social Security did not exist, the behavior of people would like totally change. Presumably, people knowing that so wages, net wages would be higher because you wouldn't have to pay the Social Security tax.
Right.
And there is a question of what people would do with the money. Would they have saved more privately, or would they have chose to consume it? And so depending on the assumptions that you are making here, the causal effect of Social Security on wealth inequality could be very different. So our paper is just measuring things. It's just trying to get the accounting right, but it doesn't really tell you what Social Security is actually doing
Right.
in terms of affecting inequality.
Is there, though, a natural next area that you would like to build off of this research to go look at next?
Right. So as you mentioned, one big source of concern for the next 10 years is this funding gap. And as I alluded to, there are several ways to solve that gap. Now, whether you solve it by reducing the benefit, changing the retirement age, or by increasing taxes, that does not affect all Americans in
Right.
the same way.
Right.
And since it's a big fraction of their wealth, the actual policy decision will have a big effect on the way the cost, the burden is like distributed among Americans. So that's like something that we are trying to do right now.
And so that puts, as you kind of alluded to, that puts more emphasis on what's going to happen on the policy side
Yes.
over the next decade to truly understand the path
Right.
that we're going to
Once
see.
you get the accounting right, you can think of, okay, if I change the rule, who gets affected, who benefits? Well, most of like in net, it's going to be a burden because there is this money that is just missing.
Yeah.
But like depending on the policy choice that you make to address this problem,
Yeah.
the who is going to be affected in terms of which cohort, and within a cohort, whether it's high income people or low income people, that really depends on the way we decide to solve that problem.
Is there enough of an understanding by the policymakers about the accounting side so they can make the proper decisions on the policy side?
So in a sense, that's what we are trying to provide in our future research. I think a lot of policymakers know about this. Now, I think the problem is that Social Security has been described as like the third rail of American politics.
Yes.
And so as long as the trust fund still has money, in a sense, I don't think any of them will say anything about this because it's just like there is only like political cost. But we know that like, so we are in 25. So in 8 years, I think, based on the latest estimate, there won't be any money left. And so at that point, policymakers will have to say, okay, we prefer to raise the retirement age, or we prefer to cut the benefit, or we prefer to raise the taxes. Those are going to be our choices.
Sylvain, great to see you again. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Sylvain Catherine, who is Assistant Professor of Finance here at the Wharton School.
Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.